Today we're going to start our new unit, which is the early Middle Ages. We're going to be taking a look at Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, and they're going to be on a long road to recovery. We're going to see how that plays out. The Middle Ages refers to Europe from 500 to 1500 CE. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Dark Ages or Medieval Europe. And during this time, a new society will develop, and that's a result of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Germanic invasions that happen as they're pushed into Western Europe by the Huns. As we remember, the Germanic peoples invaded Roman lands and would eventually sack Rome on multiple occasions, bringing about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire would continue. We called it the Byzantine Empire. So the empire is still going strong in the East. Between 500 and 1000 CE, Western Europe is going to be very different than what it was like during the time of the Romans. Western Europe becomes isolated from the advanced civilizations that are going on in the rest of the world. Civilizations like the rising Muslim Empire, the Byzantine Empire, China, and India. And Western Europe was seen as backwards. The people were poor and life was disorganized. There was no strong central government anymore to hold all the pieces of Western Europe together. They didn't have any great cities like Constantinople, and it was a struggle for these Europeans to even survive. We're going to see a huge population shift as well. People will move away from the cities and instead move to the countryside. So we have a rural agrarian society. Trade routes are going to close. We have bandits roaming the land. It's a time of lawlessness. We also have pirates on the sea. So people are afraid to trade. We see a decline of learning. The Germanic tribespeople who move into Western Europe, they can't read or write. They didn't need to. They were just trying to survive. So we no longer have a written language. Our educated nobles are going to move away from the cities and isolate themselves in the countryside. The only people who could really read or write were the priests. The Greek language will almost vanish in the West. And there's a loss of a common language. Latin had united all of Western Europe, as Latin was the official language of the Romans. Latin is no longer the official language anymore because we do not have a Roman Empire. Instead, we're going to see that Latin evolve and change as the Germanic people move into Western Europe. And instead, we'll get dialects which evolve into new languages. French, Italian, and Spanish are some of those Romance languages we've talked about. We also see German and English used across Western Europe as well. So we've got a mishmash of different languages used now where the Roman Empire used to be. There was some good news for the Europeans. There were lots of natural resources within Europe. There are forests, which means we can cut down the trees and use for lumber. Rich soil for growing our crops. Minerals like coal and iron. Coal will be important a little bit later in world history too. And seas and large rivers which people can trade upon. So what we're going to see is a blend of traditions going on in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were a combination of the classical heritage of Rome, so those old Roman ideas, the customs of the Germanic tribes, those new people who've moved into Western Europe, and it's going to be the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church that pull these two sides together. So our new society is made up of Roman ideas and Germanic values. And we can see that these two societies were very different from one another, but they're going to blend together to create society in the Middle Ages for Europeans. The Germanic peoples who move into Western Europe lived in small communities and had unwritten customs. This is very different from the Roman Empire, which had a central government and written laws. If you were a Roman, you may never even meet your governor. You would definitely not meet the emperor, but you would still follow their rules. The Germanic customs are very different. To the Germanic peoples, personal loyalty and family ties were more important. They would have a warrior chief or a warlord who would lead the people in battle, and people would give their loyalty to the warlord for weapons and loot. So they would go out, attack another village, and the warlord would then give the loot away to his soldiers who followed him in the battle. From 400 to 700 CE, these Germanic warlords carved up Europe into their own small little kingdoms. These would go on to replace the Roman provinces, but the borders were constantly changing due to warfare. Of these Germanic peoples, the Franks, who lived in Gaul or France, they were going to become the most successful. These times were chaotic, but it would be the Roman Catholic Church that would try to provide order as more and more people converted to Christianity. We've seen this map before when we were looking at the fall of the Roman Empire. We've got all of these different Germanic groups who are moving throughout Western Europe. We see the Franks, they're going to move into France. We've got Vandals, we've got the Angles and Saxons. So all these different groups are eventually going to settle down and create their own small kingdoms. And by about 500 CE, this is what the map of Europe looks like. We've got the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks, who we're going to spend the most time talking about today, living in France. And that's how France gets its name, from the Franks. So all these different groups are going to create their own kingdoms throughout Europe. So a Germanic warlord would lead a band of his warriors. The warriors would pledge their loyalty to the warlord, and in exchange, the warlord gave the warriors food, weapons, and treasure. In peacetime, the warriors would live in their lord's hall, and a warrior would not obey a lord they didn't know. So personal connections were very important to these people, which is very different from how the Roman Empire worked. A warrior would refuse to pay taxes or follow the rules of a lord that they didn't know. So the importance of personal relationships made it impossible for large territories to be governed. Okay, it's going to take a very long time for anything that even looks similar to the Roman Empire to pop up, but it's going to be the Franks who start working towards that idea of a strong central government again. A Germanic tribe called the Franks held power in Gaul, but they were disorganized. They had no central authority, no one ruler to watch over the people. That's going to change when Clovis becomes king of the Franks in 481 CE. Clovis was a powerful warlord who attracted many followers, and his goal was to unify the Franks under his leadership. In 496, he will accept Christianity. His wife had been urging him to become a Christian. But he waited until a desperate moment in battle, and he asks for help from Jesus Christ. And he says, Jesus, if I win this battle, I will become a Christian. He ends up winning the battle, so he converts to Christianity, and he will follow the Roman Catholic form of Christianity. And this story sounds very similar to that of Constantine, the Roman emperor who became a Christian. By 512, Clovis's kingdom expanded to most of modern-day France, and he grew more and more tied to the church in Rome. They were happy to work with each other. So when we look at this picture of Clovis, we can see that he is holding a staff, which has a cross on it, and he also has a crown showing his political power. Here is a picture from that time period of Clovis being baptized. Artwork in the Middle Ages is not very good. We don't have perspective, nothing looks three-dimensional. All these faces look the same. In Clovis, they don't even show his whole body here in the pot. It's just kind of like his torso sticking out. By 600 CE, most of the Germanic peoples had converted to Christianity. Missionaries from Rome would work to spread the Christian religion. The church, which was centered in Rome, would build monasteries or religious communities in rural areas. A monastery is a community made up of monks. And they gave up their material possessions and would devote their life to God. Christian women could also do something similar. Christian women were called nuns, and they would live in a convent. Education in the Middle Ages was run by the church. In 520 CE, an Italian monk named Benedict wrote a book for rules that monasteries would follow. He had a sister named Scholastica, and she wrote a version of this for convents, which nuns would follow. Monasteries would become the best educated communities in Europe. Monasteries would open up schools near villages for children to learn. They would maintain libraries, and they would copy books in a similar fashion that what we saw in the Byzantine Empire. In 590, Gregory I would become Pope. So he will run the Roman Catholic Church. And the Pope's office is known as the papacy. Pope Gregory I would expand the power of the papacy. He would make the papacy, or the role of the Pope, political or secular. So secular means to be concerned with worldly matters rather than just spiritual matters. So the Pope will become involved in politics. The Pope's palace was the center of Roman government. He would use church revenues to raise armies, repair roads, and help the poor. And the Pope would also negotiate peace treaties between different kingdoms throughout Western Europe. Here we have Pope Gregory wearing the traditional robes that a pope would wear. You'll usually notice white and red and gold. After Clovis dies, the Franks do hit a bit of a decline. One of the problems that they faced was that a king would divide his land amongst his heirs. We saw that back in Russia with Vladimir. So with each generation, you had more rulers, but each ruler had less land. And eventually those kingdoms would be broken up and smaller than the state of Connecticut, one of our smaller states. The Franks still controlled the largest kingdom. They still controlled much of Gaul. And one change that's going to take place is that the king will lose his power. Instead, a ruler called a major domo, or mayor of the palace, were the ones who were actually in charge. So the mayor of the palace was officially in charge of the royal palace, but over time they would become the leader of the army and the policy maker, and they would become more powerful than the king. So the king was more like a figurehead, and the mayor of the palace was the one who would run the show. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you had a king and the hand of the king who actually did all the work for the king. In Japan, you've got an emperor, but it was really the shogun who ran the show. Something similar is taking place here for the Franks. You've got a king, but the mayor of the palace is the one who does all the king's dirty work and really has the power. In 719, Charles Martel would become mayor of the palace. So he was in charge of the army for the Franks. And in 732, he would win the Battle of Tours, stopping the Muslim spread into Europe. We talked about that in our last unit. And he would take on the name Charles the Hammer. So we have the Battle of Tours, which takes place between Spain and France. The Muslims were trying to push from Spain into France to spread Islam, Charles Martel and his Christian Knights would stop them. This painting of the Battle of Tours was done much later than the actual battle itself. We see Charles Martel here in the center fighting against the Muslims. You'll notice that there is a Christian cross showing what Charles was fighting for. Charles Martel had a son. His son was named Pepin. And Pepin was the mayor of the palace, which meant he was doing all the work. So he also figured, well, I should be king as well. I should have this title of royalty. He's going to lead an army to help the Pope stop an invasion. And whenever you help the Pope is going to do nice things for you. And he crowned Pepin king in 752. Pepin was known as Pepin the Short. And if we see this picture here, he's actually not on his knees. He wasn't that short for the time. And the Pope is placing the crown on his head. And this begins the Carolingian dynasty. And that comes from Charles Martel and eventually Charlemagne, who we'll talk about shortly. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, is probably the most famous figure in early Middle Age history. He was the grandson of Charles Martel and the son of Pepin, and he will rule for 46 years. He conquered and reunited most of the old Roman Empire in Western Europe, and his kingdom would be larger than the Byzantine Empire. His capital city was at Aachen in Germany, and he will promote education and learning. He established a palace school with a curriculum based on classical Latin learning. If we see the picture of Charlemagne, he's wearing a crown showing his political power. His crown has a cross showing that he is a Christian and holds religious power. He's got a sword showing his military power. And he's considered the father of both France and Germany. And we see those symbols by his head. The one on the right is the fleur de lis, which you would probably see on the Saint's helmet. And that's the royal crest of the French. And he also has the eagle that will be the symbol for Germany. The light green is Charlemagne's kingdom, with its capital at Aachen, which was located in Germany. The darker green areas are areas that were loyal to him. Okay, they might have their own ruler, but they all paid tribute to Charlemagne. So as you can see, his empire was almost that of the old Roman Empire in Western Europe. Charlemagne is going to try to reform the government and make it better. He organizes his kingdom into 350 counties. They're called counties because each one would have a count who serves as a judge and local administrator. This count would also collect taxes and send it back to Charlemagne, who lived in the capital at Aachen. Charlemagne was a smart guy, though, and he didn't trust these counts. So he sets up a system called the Missi Dominici. And that would send one priest, along with a member of his court, to each of these counties each year to see how things were going and then report back to Charlemagne. Charlemagne would spread Christianity to all his conquered lands. He wasn't always nice about it. When he fought against the Baltic states, the Baltic people surrendered and said they would convert to Christianity. Charlemagne would find out a few years later that they were still practicing their pagan religion, so he sent his army in and had many of these people executed. Charlemagne would continue to have a strong relationship with the church throughout his rule. And on Christmas Day in 800 CE, he helps the Pope, Leo III, put down a rebellion. And like we said, with his father, when you do nice things for the Pope will help you out. And the Pope crowns Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. Holy because he was a Christian, and Roman because the Pope was situated in Rome, and Charlemagne followed the Roman Catholic form of Christianity. And he was an emperor, calling back to the rulers of Rome. So if we notice, we've got the Pope, who is placing the crown on the head of Charlemagne. But if the Pope is placing the crown on your head, even though you're the emperor, that means the Pope has the power. The Pope is placing the crown, but that also means if you disobey the Pope, he can take that power back. He can take that crown back from you. Here we have Charlemagne's church at his capital city of Aachen. By 800 CE, Charlemagne's realm included what is now France, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, half of Italy, Germany, and parts of Austria and Spain. Because he created this new empire, most historians consider him the founder of both France and Germany. And Charlemagne's the one who officially brings together the legacy of the Romans with the Germanic customs and traditions, and it's the Roman Catholic Church that he uses to bring this new society into being. After Charlemagne dies, his son Louis the Pious becomes the next emperor. Pious means devout and religious, which Louis was, but he was a poor ruler. One of his biggest mistakes was on his deathbed. Louis had 3 sons, and instead of naming one of them his heir, he split his kingdom between these 3 sons. And of course, these sons will fight each other for power. So the empire that Clovis and Charles Martel and Charlemagne had worked to create is going to be undone by the fighting between these 3 sons. They're going to have a peace agreement called the Treaty of Verdun, but it splits this kingdom up, and eventually we're right back to where we started after the fall of the Roman Empire. We no longer have that central authority anymore. So the Treaty of Verdun broke up the Frankish kingdom. We have Charles the Bald, who takes control of the West Frankish kingdom. Louis the German gets the East Frankish kingdom in what is today Germany. Lothar controls the central area, and when he dies, he splits it up even further between his sons, Lothar II, Charles the Young, and Louis II. I like these guys' nicknames. They've got the Bald and the German. There was a Charles the Simple, Charles the Fat as well. They come up with some pretty clever nicknames. So that's going to be it for notes, and we will take a quick break.